In a packed courtroom, billionaire mine boss Derek Cole thought he owned the judge, the town, and the truth. But when veteran Jim Walker walked in with Rex and dropped one worn military satchel
The
on the
evidence you
table,
need is right here in this
everything
bag.
changed.
These
Inside
drives
that
contain
bag was
truth.
the evidence Cole never thought anyone would find. Evidence that could burn his entire empire to the ground. Dust Haven wasn't the kind of town people found by accident. It sat deep in the Appalachian Mountains, wrapped in a gray winter sky that never seemed to lift, and dusted in coal powder that settled into every crack of every wooden house. The wind cut through the valley like it had a personal grudge, and folks here learned long ago that hope came slow, but hardship came fast. It was the perfect place for a man trying to disappear. A man like Jim Walker. Jim was 50, broad-shouldered, worn at the edges, with gray stubble and eyes that had seen too much of the world. After years serving as a military investigator, he traded chaos for a small cabin on the edge of Dust Haven, hoping silence would finally drown out everything he wanted to forget. His only companion was Rex, a 4-year-old German shepherd, strong, intelligent, and loyal to the bone. Rex didn't bark much. He didn't need to. His presence alone reminded Jim that he wasn't completely alone in the world. Most people in Dust Haven didn't know Jim well, but they knew enough. They knew he kept to himself. They knew he didn't talk about the military. They knew he avoided trouble, until trouble found him first. And in a town built on broken promises and blackened hillsides, trouble never had to walk far. One cold morning, as the wind scraped against the cabin walls, 3 men appeared on Jim's snow-covered path. Henry Marsh led the way, a stout 48-year-old miner with coal-stained skin and a limp that told its own story. Behind him came Caleb Morris, tall and gaunt, his cheeks hollowed by years underground. And then Tommy Briggs, just 22, freckles still on his face but fear in his eyes, like someone who had watched his future collapse before it even began. Henry knocked softly, almost apologetic. Jim opened the door, and Rex was instantly on alert, ears up, reading the tension before a word was spoken. "Jim, we didn't know where else to go," Henry said, voice cracked from decades of shouting over heavy machinery. Jim stepped aside, letting them in. Rex circled them, not aggressive, just assessing, always assessing. Inside, the cabin felt even smaller with their worry filling the space. Jim poured coffee while they sat, trying to warm hands that had long forgotten comfort. It was Henry who finally spoke, his voice unsteady. For 7 years, Black Ridge Mining had been quietly draining money from the workers' retirement fund. No warnings, no explanations, just missing dollars, then missing paychecks, and eventually missing futures. Behind it all stood Derek Cole, the billionaire owner of the company. 55 years old, silver hair always perfectly combed, and the kind of cold stare that made men feel smaller than they were. He wore charcoal Italian suits even in the dirtiest parts of town, and made decisions with the kind of detachment only a man who never feared consequences could have. And now, Cole had stolen the very lifeline of Dust Haven. Caleb leaned forward, hands shaking. "We noticed the first cuts years ago, but now the whole fund's almost gone." Tommy's voice cracked. "My dad worked that mine his whole life. He died in a collapse. Everything he left us, everything, Cole stole it." Rex let out a soft growl, picking up on the helpless anger weighing down the room. Jim didn't respond right away. He just listened, really listened. He'd heard stories like this before, but usually overseas, in places where corruption wore uniforms instead of suits. He stared into the fire, letting the truth settle in. Henry watched him closely. "We heard about you, about what you used to do. They said you could find answers buried deeper than the mines themselves." Jim didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. The silence around him did it for him. Henry lowered his voice. "If this continues, 600 families will lose everything. This town won't survive." Jim felt the weight of those words. He felt Rex nudge his hand, sensing his uncertainty. And he felt something stirring inside him, something he thought he'd buried along with the past. He looked at the three men, exhausted yet still clinging to the smallest thread of hope. Then he drew in a steady breath. Rex stood at his side, posture stiff, ready for the path Jim would choose. And Jim chose. "All right," he said quietly, but his voice carried the strength of a man who had once uncovered lies in far darker places. "We're bringing everything into the light, every lie, every stolen dollar." The miners exhaled in disbelief and relief. Outside, the mountain wind screamed as though warning Jim of the storm he'd just stepped into. But Jim Walker didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he felt purpose return. And whatever Derek Cole had buried, Jim Walker would dig it up. The federal courthouse in Charleston, West Virginia, was nothing like Dust Haven. It was bright, towering, polished, a place where the powerful moved like they owned the oxygen inside it. Yet on that morning, even the marble walls felt tense as crowds filled every bench. Reporters whispered. Miners gathered in worn jackets. Lawyers adjusted ties like preparing for combat. And then Derek Cole entered, strolling through the doors with the smug confidence of a man who believed the world still bent for him. His charcoal Italian suit blended perfectly with his silver hair, his posture straight, his expression carved from ice. Trailing behind Derek was Victor Hargrove, a 50-year-old legal predator with a chiseled face, razor-sharp jaw, and dark, slicked-back hair showing streaks of steel gray. His eyes were narrow, fox-like, always measuring his opponent before striking. He earned the nickname the chokeholder of the courtroom for the way he destroyed witnesses with words alone. His tailored navy suit clung to his lean frame, and every step he took echoed authority. He didn't just win cases, he humiliated anyone who dared stand against him. More lawyers followed Victor, 6 in total, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than the average miner's monthly salary. They sat like a Roman legion guarding an emperor. Derek flashed a confident smirk, as if today was merely an inconvenience. But when Jim Walker and Rex entered from the opposite door, the room shifted, not in fear, but in disbelief. A ripple of laughter rolled across the benches. The contrast between the two sides was almost theatrical. Derek Cole's polished empire versus a battle-worn veteran in a military cold-weather parka and his German shepherd. Victor leaned back, voice dripping with mockery. A veteran and a dog? Did someone mistake the federal courthouse for an animal shelter? His comment drew snickers from Derek's lawyers. Jim didn't react. Rex didn't react. They simply kept walking until they reached the plaintiff's table. Jim set down a faded military-issue document bag, its canvas scarred, its zippers dulled by sand and time. The bag had followed him across continents, through war zones where truth was buried under rubble. No one in the courtroom knew that inside it lay evidence capable of shattering Black Ridge mining from the inside out. Judge Eleanor Whitford entered moments later. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp cheekbones, silver hair pulled tight into a bun, and eyes that cut through lies before they were even spoken. She had spent 30 years on the bench, surviving corruption scandals, political storms, and high-profile corporate wars. Her black robe flowed like a shadow behind her as she took her seat. She scanned the courtroom with a stern expression until it quieted under her authority. When her gaze landed on Jim, something in her eyes softened. Not pity, but recognition of quiet strength. The bailiff called the court to order, and the tension thickened. Victor rose first, always eager to control the stage. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "the defense moves to dismiss this case on grounds of insufficient standing. Mr. Walker is not an employee, not a shareholder, and has no authority to bring claims regarding corporate finances." Victor smiled as if he'd already won. Jim stood slowly, his posture steady. Before he could speak, a new figure stepped into the courtroom. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lydia Hart. She was 38, tall, with warm brown skin, tightly curled black hair, and glasses that framed a face both calm and intimidating. She carried a thick folder hugged against a burgundy blazer. Lydia addressed the judge with unwavering confidence. "Your Honor, the United States has reviewed Mr. Walker's preliminary findings. The miners of Dust Haven lack the resources to fight this battle, so Mr. Walker filed on their behalf. Under whistleblower protection statutes, he has full standing." Victor's smirk faltered. Lydia continued, "And we have reason to believe Black Ridge Mining engaged in systematic pension fraud, falsified safety audits, and interstate wire manipulation." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Derek Cole shifted in his seat for the first time. Jim watched Lydia with quiet surprise. He didn't expect help. He certainly didn't expect someone like her, a prosecutor with a reputation for sharp logic and an unwavering moral compass, to join the fight. Lydia glanced at Jim briefly, offering a single nod. "I came because what you found matters." Jim nodded back, his gratitude silent but clear. Victor rose again, refusing to let momentum slip. "Allegations," he snapped. "All we have are allegations." He turned to Jim with a predator's grin. "Perhaps our war hero would like to share where he learned financial law, in a desert bunker?" More laughter echoed. Jim didn't smile. Instead, he unzipped the old military bag. The sound alone silenced the room. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a stack of hard drives, a weathered notebook, and a handful of sealed evidence bags. Their surfaces were scratched, but the labels were meticulous. Dates, locations, encrypted codes. Lydia's eyes widened as she recognized the formatting. These were internal corporate logs, exported from systems not meant to be accessed by outsiders. Victor froze. Jim spoke for the first time. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who didn't need to shout to be believed. "These drives contain 7 years of pension withdrawals, hidden under contractor payments. I found the pattern after speaking with the miners. Then I traced the offshore accounts." Derek lunged halfway out of his seat. "Your Honor, this man hacked—" Jim cut him off calmly. "No, Mr. Cole. You used a cloud-based administrator panel that synced across your entire executive team. One executive didn't change his default password." He placed a printed image on the table, an email screenshot revealing login credentials. Across the courtroom, a man in a suit, a mid-level accountant named Roger Kemplin, turned pale. He was 43, short, slightly overweight, with thinning hair and nervous eyes. He tried to sink into his seat, but Jim's next words sealed his fate. "Mr. Kemplin, you sent quarterly financial summaries to Mr. Cole for approval. You also authorized pension adjustments. I imagine the court would like to hear how those adjustments were justified." Roger's hands shook visibly. Victor stood quickly. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is attempting to interrogate my client's staff without—" Judge Whitford cut through his objection with a raised hand. "Sit down, Mr. Hargrove." Her voice was calm, but the undercurrent of authority was unmistakable. She turned to Jim. "Mr. Walker, you will present your evidence formally." Jim nodded and handed Lydia a USB drive from the bag. Lydia connected it to the court's system. Moments later, Spreadsheets filled the projector screen. Rows, dates, transfers, amounts, and a suspicious pattern that no trained investigator could ignore. Every number was a nail in Derek Cole's coffin. Victor tried to recover, stepping forward in desperation. "None of this proves wrongdoing. Standard operating..." Lydia pointed to a specific column. "This account leads to an offshore shell corporation registered under Mr. Cole's personal trust." The audience murmured loudly. Even miners in the gallery leaned forward, recognizing the proof they'd feared would never come. Derek's facade cracked. Sweat glistened at his temple, though he tried to hide it by adjusting his tie. Jim wasn't finished. He placed the final item from his bag onto the table, a small voice recorder battered from sand and time. "This contains audio from a meeting between Derek Cole and regional supervisors. He threatened to cut safety protocols to save money. Days later, a collapse killed 3 miners. Tommy Briggs, sitting in the gallery, inhaled sharply. His father was one of those 3. For a moment, the whole courtroom held its breath. Judge Whitford leaned forward. "Mr. Walker, does this recording include direct threats or admissions?" Jim met her gaze without wavering. "Yes, Your Honor. You will hear Derek Cole say, and I quote, 'Safety delays profit. If they don't like it, replace them.'" A collective shiver moved through the courtroom. Even Victor's polished composure cracked as he looked at his client with disbelief. Judge Whitford's voice hardened to steel. "The court will recess for 30 minutes. Mr. Hargrove, when we return, be prepared to explain why your client should not face immediate federal indictment." As she struck the gavel, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Derek's empire had begun to crumble, and the first blow came not from a corporation or a government body, but from a quiet man in a weathered parka and his loyal dog. Victor Hargrove rose first, stepping into the center of the courtroom like an actor entering a spotlight. His navy suit hugged his lean frame perfectly, and his sharp jaw seemed even more pronounced under the overhead lights. He began his opening in a smooth, confident cadence, the tone of a man used to bending juries with nothing but charisma. Victor painted Derek Cole as a misunderstood visionary, a man who invested in dying towns, funded local infrastructure, and created hundreds of jobs. He gestured dramatically toward the gallery where miners watched with tight jaws, framing them as victims of financial confusion. He insisted the pension discrepancies were merely administrative misunderstandings, amplified by individuals who lacked literacy in corporate finance. His voice dripped with condescension, each word crafted like a surgical cut meant to undermine the miners' credibility while elevating Derek's. Judge Whitford listened without expression, but Jim could see her pen tapping with increasing impatience. When Victor finished, he turned to the jury with a proud, almost theatrical bow. Then he glanced at Jim with a smirk that said, "Try topping that." Jim stood slowly, pushing back his chair with calm precision. He held no notes, no binder, not even a single printed page. His military cold-weather parka looked out of place among the polished suits, but he wore it like armor. He rested his hands lightly on the table, then straightened, his eyes scanning the courtroom, not challengingly, but purposefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and low, a voice trained to deliver truth under fire. $12 million vanished, Jim said, and I know exactly where it went. The statement fell into the room like a dropped weight. Conversations died instantly. Even the court reporter paused before resuming her rapid keystrokes. Jim reached down and lifted a thick folder sealed with a dust-coated clip. He placed it gently onto the evidence table. The miners in the gallery leaned forward. Victor froze mid-smirk. Jim continued, describing a forgotten offline ledger server hidden deep within Mine Shaft 4. The miners knew the place well. It had been abandoned after a collapse years ago. Jim explained that the server had stored internal backups. Black Ridge Mining never successfully destroyed during their system upgrade. His voice never rose, but every detail landed with precision. The courtroom shifted again when Jim named the shell company, Red Horizon LLC. He explained that Red Horizon was set up under a layered corporate structure, the kind designed to obscure ownership. But the transfers were clear. Regular withdrawals from workers' pensions, routed through intermediaries, then funneled directly into Red Horizon's accounts. The revelation struck like a shockwave. Caleb Morris in the gallery gasped audibly. Tommy Briggs clenched the bench so hard his knuckles turned white. Judge Whitford leaned forward for the first time all morning, her eyes narrowing sharply. Victor shot to his feet, voice cracking with urgency. "Objection! This data is illegitimate. It was hacked, stolen, and inadmissible." Jim did not react to the outburst. Instead, he turned toward Victor with the calm, unblinking gaze of a man who had weathered tougher storms under harsher suns. "No," Jim said. "I took this from an offline backup located in Mine 4. He let that sink in. A backup your team forgot existed." He raised a hand toward Rex. "And Rex found it." A ripple of astonishment swept through the room as all eyes turned to the German shepherd. Rex lifted his head, alert but composed, as though understanding he had just been praised in front of an audience. The prosecution table shifted as Lydia Hart stepped forward, her expression sharp. Judge Whitford asked Jim to authenticate the documents, and Lydia provided corroboration. She explained how the metadata aligned with internal Black Ridge timestamps and how the file paths matched those used by Derek's executives. To further authenticate, Lydia called an IT specialist who had assisted her. Aaron Delgado, a man in his mid-30s, short, broad-shouldered, with a dark beard and calm demeanor shaped by years of cyber forensic work. Aaron wore a simple charcoal dress shirt and carried himself with a patient professionalism. He testified that the files showed no signs of tampering. Every line of code was consistent with a native export from Black Ridge's obsolete system. Derek Cole began to unravel. Sweat collected along his perfectly pressed collar. His silver hair, usually immaculate, clung slightly to his temple. His fingers tapped frantically on the table. Judge Whitford noticed and addressed him sternly. "Mr. Cole, you will maintain composure in my courtroom." Derek nodded stiffly, but couldn't hide the panic brewing in his eyes. His empire wasn't cracking. It was collapsing. His lawyers whispered urgently among themselves, but Victor looked furious, betrayed by his client's lack of control. Jim wasn't done. He next displayed a secondary chain of transactions, smaller amounts but more numerous, redirected to a personal account under the alias of a man named Howell Briggs. When the name echoed through the courtroom, Tommy Briggs' face drained of color. Jim clarified immediately. Howell Briggs, a former Black Ridge logistics manager, was not related to Tommy. He was a 60-year-old corporate fixer with a narrow face, deep wrinkles, and a reputation for doing dirty stabilization work across several mining companies. Howell had disappeared 2 years earlier, leaving behind rumors, debts, and suspected blackmail files. Jim revealed that Howell had approved dozens of suspicious fund transfers before vanishing. Judge Whitford ordered the documents entered into evidence. She then looked sternly at Victor. "Mr. Hargrove, do you have an explanation?" Victor's jaw tensed. He rose slowly. "Your Honor, this is all circumstantial." Lydia cut in. "No, it's systematic." She pulled up a digital timeline, color-coded, meticulously organized, showing 7 years of siphoning aligned with Derek's acquisition of new properties. Each acquisition was funded suspiciously soon after a pension withdrawal. He built his empire with stolen retirements, Lydia said. Her voice carried not theatrics, but righteous anger. The room felt colder as the implications settled. Miners had died in collapses, families had gone bankrupt, medical bills had piled up, all while Derek financed luxury estates under shell corporations. Jim stepped back, letting the evidence speak for itself. He looked at Rex, and Rex seemed to sense the shift. The dog's ears relaxed slightly, his posture easing as though he knew the truth had finally gained ground. The final blow came when Jim placed a photo on the evidence screen. It showed Derek entering a private bank in Asheville alongside a man wearing sunglasses and a thick coat. Jim explained that this man was Leonard Pike, a 45-year-old financial courier known for facilitating high-value off-books transfers. Pike had a shaved head, a scar across his left eyebrow, and a reputation as someone who never spoke unless paid handsomely. Jim had traced multiple interactions between Pike and Derek in weeks preceding major pension withdrawals. This wasn't negligence. It was theft. Calculated, deliberate, ruthless. Judge Whitford breathed out slowly, the weight of the fraud towering in her mind. She looked at Derek with an expression that blended disappointment and disgust. "This court will not tolerate the exploitation of working-class families," she said. Her voice echoed through the courtroom with the force of a gavel. "We will recess for 1 hour. When we return, I expect the defense to answer these allegations, fully." As the gavel struck, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Reporters surged. Miners embraced each other. Derek sagged in his seat, color draining. Victor glared at him, betrayal clear in his eyes. And at the center of it all stood Jim Walker, silent, steady, resolute, Rex sitting faithfully beside him. The trap had sprung, and the empire of shadows was finally exposed. The courtroom had not yet cooled from the shock of Jim's evidence when Judge Eleanor Whitford returned to the bench. The hour-long recess had changed nothing except the emotional temperature of the room. Miners looked angrier. Lawyers looked more nervous. Derek Cole looked as if the earth beneath him had begun to split open. Jim Walker sat still, his military cold-weather parka zipped up to the collar, Rex resting by his boots, eyes sharp and attentive. When the judge called court back to order, Jim rose with a calm resolve that felt heavier than mere confidence. He announced his next witness, Elias Turner. Elias Turner entered slowly from the rear doors, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. At 62, the man looked older than his age. Years spent underground had carved wrinkles into his weathered face and coated his clothes with a permanent gray tint. His beard was white, trimmed short, and his hands trembled slightly from nerve damage after a mine explosion 15 years earlier. His walk carried the ache of a life built on dangerous labor, but his eyes, a pale steel blue, still held a stubborn spark. He wore a faded denim jacket and work boots that had clearly seen more mines than sunlight. The courtroom softened as he stepped inside, because everyone knew who he was. The man who'd been fired for asking too many questions. Victor Hargrove watched Elias approach the witness stand with a smirk that almost hid his contempt. He adjusted the sleeves of his navy suit, his sharp jaw tightening. To Victor, Elias was exactly the type of witness he loved to destroy. Old, worn down, lacking formal education, easy to discredit. But Jim walked beside Elias, steadying him gently by the arm. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't staged. It was instinct, one man helping another to stand. As Elias settled into the witness chair, Jim placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Just tell the truth," he said quietly. Elias nodded, lifting his chin. Under oath, Elias began recounting his story in a voice that wavered at first, but strengthened with each word. He explained that he had worked for Black Ridge Mining for more than 40 years, starting as a teenager. He described the shift changes, the long tunnels, the collapses, and the slow disappearance of safety standards. Then he described the day everything changed, when he asked about missing pension contributions. According to Elias, Derek Cole personally summoned him to a storage office behind the processing plant. Derek, dressed in his immaculate charcoal Italian suit, told Elias he was stepping out of line, and that miners were replaceable parts. Elias's voice tightened. "He told us we were just cogs," he said. "If one of us died, the machine kept moving. Chet Kung Chang I Quan Tam." A murmur of outrage rippled through the courtroom gallery. Miners who had held their anger now clenched it like a weapon. Even Judge Whitford's sharp eyes softened in disbelief at the cruelty described. Rex lifted his head in response to the rising tension, scanning the room with a quiet readiness. Jim stood with hands behind his back, listening carefully, not shifting, not flinching. Elias continued, describing how he was fired the very next day without severance or explanation. His pension was locked, his insurance cut, and his access badge deactivated before he could even gather his belongings. Everything he had earned vanished with one conversation. Victor rose instantly, smelling blood in the water. "Your Honor," he said, voice ringing confidently, "the defense questions the credibility of this witness." He approached the stand, heel clicks echoing like a metronome of arrogance. "Mr. Turner, you have no documentation, no recordings, and no written statements. All you offer is the angry story of an old man bitter about losing his job." He emphasized the word old, letting it hang heavily. Elias looked shaken, his fingers gripping the arms of the witness chair. Victor turned to the jury. "Is this what the prosecution brings? Rumors from a disgruntled retiree? Nothing more?" The mockery in his tone was unmistakable. Jim stepped forward slowly. "Objection," he said, voice calm but steeled. Judge Whitford raised a hand. "Mr. Walker, do you have a foundation to challenge this?" Jim didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back to his table, reached into his old military-issued bag, and retrieved a small black USB drive. It was scuffed, slightly bent at the corner, the plastic worn down from years of use. Jim walked toward the judge and held it up so the room could see. Victor's confidence faltered. Jim's voice remained measured. "I do have evidence," he said. "This." The courtroom shifted in an instant. The USB looked insignificant, but its presence alone created a visible ripple of fear in Derek Cole. Derek's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his fingers scraping anxiously at his silk tie. Victor's eyes narrowed sharply, attempting to read Jim's intentions. Judge Whitford leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Walker," she said, "what is on that device?" Jim answered without hesitation. "It contains audio logs from Black Ridge Mining's internal security system. One of the guards was instructed to delete them years ago, but he didn't. He saved a copy on this drive." The room erupted. Lydia Hart's eyes widened. The miners gasped. Victor turned pale. At that moment, Jim revealed the guard's name: Carl Raynard. Carl was a 40-year-old former security supervisor, stocky and broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut, a thick brown beard, and a noticeable scar along his left cheek, earned during a confrontation with a trespasser years before. Carl was known as a quiet, observant man with a complicated moral line. He wouldn't lie, but he wouldn't normally go against the company either. According to Jim, Carl had approached him only after hearing about the case, going federal. He feared retaliation, but his conscience finally won. Carl had kept a backup of the audio files because, in his words, someday someone would need the truth. Judge Whitford ordered the USB to be authenticated. Lydia approached with precision, connecting it to the court's secure playback system. Before the audio even began, Victor barked, "Your Honor, this is absurd!" But the judge silenced him with a single glare. When the first recording played, the room fell into a hush so deep it became almost eerie. Derek's voice filled the speakers, cold, dismissive, dripping with disdain. A meeting in which he called the miners expendable, another recording where he ordered safety oversight to be bypassed, and lastly, the unmistakable heated exchange where Derek threatened Elias Turner for asking questions. The final blow came when Derek said, "If Turner keeps sniffing around the books, shut him down, fire him, and if he talks, bury him in paperwork or bury him in a report. Either way, he disappears." Gasps filled the air. A woman in the gallery began to cry. Tommy Briggs clenched his jaw so tightly that tears welled in his eyes, not of sorrow, but of vindication. Elias Turner stared at the floor, trembling as decades of truth finally broke free from the shadows. Derek Cole sat frozen, complexion draining to a sickly gray. Even Victor Hargrove took a step away from him, distancing himself from the sinking ship. Judge Whitford inhaled deeply, her expression shifting from shock to righteous fury. She looked at Jim with a newfound gravity, as if recognizing that the quiet veteran in the parka had just delivered the most devastating blow of the entire case. Rex nudged Jim's leg gently, sensing the emotional weight in the room. Jim ended the moment with a simple statement. This is what they did to him, and to hundreds more. No theatrics, no embellishment, just truth. The recording continued to echo through the courtroom, each word ricocheting off the marble walls like a hammer-breaking stone. Derek Cole's voice, smooth, arrogant, unmistakably his, filled the speakers. His tone in the audio was casual, almost amused, as he spoke about the pension fund like it was a toy he could pick apart. "Don't worry about the pension accounts," the recording continued. "Just skim from their wages. Those old miners can't read their pay stubs anyway." Gasps erupted throughout the gallery. Some miners shouted in disbelief. Others stared ahead in stunned silence, their faces red with fury. Jim stood motionless, his military cold-weather parka zipped to the collar, hands clasped behind his back. Rex sat at his feet, ears forward, as if absorbing the tension vibrating through the room. Derek Cole shot to his feet. His charcoal Italian suit, once pristine and commanding, now seemed to hang off him like armor on a sinking soldier. His face flushed a deep crimson as he pointed toward Jim. "This is illegal," he shouted, voice cracking. "He recorded me without consent. He set me up. This is a trap." His silk tie was crooked, his hair out of place, his eyes frantic. Judge Eleanor Whitford fixed him with a stare sharp enough to cut steel. "Mr. Cole," she warned, "you will not shout in my court." But Derek was unraveling. "This is fake. He manipulated—" Jim raised a hand calmly, cutting through Derek's panic like a blade through smoke. "I didn't record you," Jim said, voice steady. "Your own employee did." The room shifted again, every head turning back toward Jim. He continued, explaining how a frightened IT technician secretly made a copy of the recording after Derek threatened to bury him in Shaft 7. Jim paused, letting the implication hang. The technician's name was then revealed. Mason Hale, a 31-year-old systems engineer with a thin frame, pale complexion, messy brown hair, and a nervous energy that had grown worse after years working under Derek's oppressive oversight. Mason had been known as a quiet genius, a man who could solve any network failure but couldn't look supervisors in the eye. As Jim described Mason, the gallery murmured with recognition. A few miners nodded. Some remembered the young man who often fixed broken RFID scanners in the tunnels, Jim added that Mason had reached out anonymously after realizing the investigation was going federal. He feared Derek's threats were not just bluffs. Mason believed saving the recording was the only way to protect himself, and the only way to expose what he called the truth rotting inside the company. Victor Hargrove looked nauseous. His polished composure cracked. The chokeholder of the courtroom seemed unable to breathe. Judge Whitford ordered the recording to continue. The next part was darker. Derek's voice grew colder, calculating. If anyone asks questions, the recording said, "Get rid of them, fire them, replace them, or shut them up. This is business, not charity. No one cares about washed-up minors begging for benefits." That line detonated through the room like dynamite. Elias Turner, still sitting in the witness area, covered his mouth as tears collected in his eyes. Tommy Briggs slammed a hand on the railing. Even Lydia Hart, standing near the prosecution table, clenched her jaw at the sheer cruelty in the words. Victor sprang from his seat again. "Your Honor, the authenticity of this recording—" Judge Whitford cut him off instantly. "Mr. Hargrove, sit down." Victor obeyed, but his trembling hands betrayed him. He had lost control of the battlefield. Jim stepped forward again, removing a small envelope from his battered military satchel. Inside was a written affidavit from Mason Hale, detailing how he copied the audio from the security server, encrypted it, and hid it inside a maintenance folder labeled as Thermal Sensor Logs. Mason had slipped the copied USB into Jim's mailbox at Dust Haven after hearing word of Jim's investigation. Lydia Hart confirmed she had personally cross-verified the audio's metadata, confirming it was untouched since its original creation. The courtroom's mood plunged into breathless silence. Judge Whitford asked Jim to continue. Jim explained how Mason had witnessed Derek ordering mid-level supervisors to manipulate payroll documentation and redirect lost funds into Red Horizon LLC. He described how Mason endured constant intimidation, Derek threatening to make an example of him, Victor allegedly warning him that careless techs are the first to get replaced. Though Victor denied it, the weight of the evidence made his denial meaningless. Jim then handed the judge a small stack of printed screenshots, encrypted email fragments Mason intercepted. Messages like, "Transfer now," "Erase logs," and "Turner problem solved." The gallery reacted with outrage. Some minors cried, others clenched fists. Judge Whitford called for calm, but her voice trembled with controlled fury. She examined each document carefully, her expression growing colder with every page. Derek leaned back into his chair, his body seemingly shrinking. The powerful mining magnate now looked like a man awaiting a verdict he already knew was coming. His silk tie loosened, the charcoal suit wrinkled at the sleeves, sweat shining at his temples. But Jim wasn't done. He played a final short audio clip. The voice on the recording belonged not to Derek, but to Victor Hargrove. Victor's tone was hushed and irritated as he said, "Cole, you can't keep saying this stuff out loud. Someone's going to catch you one day." That single sentence struck Victor like a lightning bolt. His face blanched white. Whispering erupted again in the gallery. Victor had known. He wasn't just defending a corrupt client. He had been aware of the scheme long, before the trial began. Jim allowed the clip to end before stepping back, expression unreadable. Victor stumbled to his feet, struggling to find words. "Your Honor, this is taken out of context." Judge Whitford stared down at him, the same way a hurricane stares down the coastline. "Mr. Hargrove," she said slowly, "you may want to speak very carefully from this point forward, as the court may consider referring your conduct for federal review." Victor sank into his chair, defeated. He had gone into this trial armed with arrogance. Now he sat with nothing but fear. Jim approached the judge's bench one last time to present Mason's personal testimony statement. It detailed not only the recordings, but also the day Mason claimed Derek cornered him in a storage hallway, gripping him by the collar, whispering, "You're one file away from disappearing." Mason wrote that he saved the recording because he couldn't trust anyone. Not HR, not managers, not corporate legal. He concluded the letter by saying, "I gave this to the only person who listens to minors, Jim Walker." Judge Whitford folded the statement gently, as if holding something fragile yet powerful. She looked at Jim, meeting his eyes. For a moment the room was quiet, as if even the air paused. Rex nudged Jim's boot again, sensing the shift. The judge exhaled. "The court will adjourn for today," she said. "Tomorrow we proceed with immediate hearings on potential criminal charges." Her voice carried a weight that made Derek slump further in his chair. As the gavel cracked, reporters surged. Miners rose roaring with vindication, and Jim Walker, quiet, steady, anchored in truth, stood with Rex at his side, knowing the giant had finally begun to fall. The moment Jim Walker lifted the final document, the temperature inside the federal courtroom felt as if it dropped 10 degrees. The thick packet contained Derek Cole's secret expansion blueprint, plans for a new mining site buried deep beneath the Appalachia Ridge, financed entirely with stolen retirement funds. Jim's voice remained controlled, but there was a steel edge underneath it as he explained how the blueprint connected to a separate environmental report about toxic chemical dumping into Eastern Run, a narrow stream used by hundreds of families. Judge Whitford leaned forward, her silver brows furrowing while the miners in the gallery held their breath. Derek Cole, still wearing his expensive charcoal Italian suit and silk tie, clenched his jaw as Jim read the numbers out loud. The cancers, the sickness, the deaths. For the first time, the billionaire's mask cracked. Jim continued without raising his voice, describing the waste runoff diagrams and the covert pipes installed behind Shaft 9, directing poison straight into the water table. A young mother in the crowd started crying. Her husband, a broad-shouldered coal cutter named Dale Monroe, with deep-set eyes and black coal dust permanently embedded into his skin, put his arm around her. Jim held up the photos taken from his own night inspection, showing Rex in the background sniffing near a rusted pipe. Proof that a military-trained German shepherd could find what Derek's inspectors couldn't. Derek twitched in his seat, his fingertips tapping nervously on the defense table, while Victor Hargrove stared at the ground, sweating. Jim stepped toward the center of the courtroom as he explained how the chemicals used, methylcyanates and industrial byproducts, were strictly illegal for disposal anywhere near residential areas. He mentioned that an anonymous worker provided a map marking the dumping points, and at that moment Jim called the worker forward. The doors creaked as a new witness entered. Nora Bennett, a 46-year-old environmental technician with sharp cheekbones, dark auburn hair tied tightly, and a calm but haunted expression. Nora was tough. Her father died of lung disease from mining, and she had spent 2 decades trying to protect the land she grew up on. She held a worn binder full of test results, and her steady voice filled the courtroom as she confirmed that Derek ordered her to falsify reports. Nora testified that she refused and was demoted to night shifts in unsafe areas. She explained that she documented everything: the pH levels, the contamination spread, the red discoloration of the rocks. Her voice shook only once when she talked about children getting sick. Derek slammed a hand on the table, shouting that she was a liar. Judge Whitford snapped at him to sit. Jim quietly thanked Nora, then handed the judge the folder she brought. The thud of that binder landing on the bench echoed like a hammer striking a coffin. Victor tried to lean over and whisper instructions to Derek, but the billionaire shoved him away. Everything escalated when Jim played a short voicemail recording. The deep voice on the audio was unmistakably Derek Cole's. "If the tests come back dirty again, make them clean. Or I'll find someone who will." The miners gasped. Derek jumped out of his chair, yelling that the audio was edited, that Jim was framing him. But the damage was done. Jim didn't react. He simply stepped aside, allowing Judge Whitford to replay the voicemail a second time. The tension in the room solidified, and even Victor Hargrove, normally quick-witted and sharp-tongued, looked like a man whose world was collapsing. The courtroom descended into chaos when Jim finally said the words that ripped through every heart present. He didn't just steal from them, he poisoned them. Rex rose to his feet with a low growl, reacting instinctively to the emotional storm behind them. Derek's face drained of color, and even Victor stumbled backward as if physically struck. The miners erupted, some shouting, some crying, others whispering prayers. A few men clenched their fists while women held on to each other. Jim lifted a hand to calm the crowd, and for a moment, the entire room listened to only him. Just then, the heavy courtroom doors burst open. 10 federal agents stormed inside, 4 from the IRS Criminal Division, 3 from the EPA's Environmental Enforcement Unit, and 3 U.S. Marshals in tactical vests. At the front was Special Agent Rivera, a stern-looking woman around 40 with chestnut skin, a strong jawline, and braided black hair pulled into a tight bun. She raised a badge and announced in a commanding voice that carried through the hall, "Derek Cole, you are under arrest for financial fraud, money laundering, environmental violations, and reckless endangerment." Derek's reaction was explosive. He swung toward Victor, pointing a shaking finger right at the lawyer's chest. "You said I would win. You said he had nothing." Victor, normally unflappable, stepped backward like a cornered animal. His face turned ghostly as he muttered, I didn't know he had this. I didn't know he had any of it." His voice cracked into a whisper. The courtroom watched the collapse of an alliance built on greed and arrogance. Jim stood silently beside Rex, his calm presence contrasting sharply with the chaos around them. As agents approached Derek, he began screaming hysterically, insisting Jim was a fraud, a nobody. One agent grabbed his arm, but Derek resisted, shouting curses and knocking papers off the table. 2 marshals pinned him down while Special Agent Rivera read him his rights. The billionaire's expensive charcoal Italian suit crumpled beneath the agent's hold, and his silk tie swung wildly as he struggled. Victor made no move to help his former client. Instead, he sat heavily onto the defense bench, staring at the floor as if the truth had finally suffocated him. The judge called for order, but the room had become a whirlwind of emotions. Some miners applauded, others cried. Jim placed a hand on Rex's head, grounding the dog who sensed the tension. Nora Bennett wiped tears from her cheeks as she watched Derek escorted out in handcuffs. Dale Monroe hugged his wife tightly. Even Judge Whitford softened, her stern expression giving way to a quiet, exhausted relief as she observed justice unfolding in real time. Jim simply stood there, breathing steadily, knowing this was only one step toward healing a broken community. When the agents pulled Derek through the doors, the silence that followed was stark and heavy. For the first time since the trial began, the weight of the truth felt lighter. Jim looked back at the miners, faces worn, scarred, hopeful. Rex sat proudly beside him, chest out. Victor Hargrove rose shakily and attempted to leave, but Special Agent Rivera stopped him. "Mr. Hargrove, don't go far," she warned. "We have questions about your involvement." Victor froze, realizing he too could fall. His hands trembled as he sat back down, defeated. As Judge Whitford announced a recess, Jim gathered the final documents from the evidence table. He looked at Nora, Elias, the miners, and then back at Rex. The German shepherd wagged his tail once, as if sensing victory, but knowing the fight to rebuild Dust Haven was just beginning. Jim stepped outside the courtroom doors, inhaling the cold West Virginia air that rushed in. Behind him, the mountain that had cast a shadow over the town for decades had finally begun to crumble. 3 months after Derek Cole's arrest, the once broken mining town of Dust Haven stood beneath a bright Appalachian morning that felt nothing like the dark winters before. The community center, a large brick building with steel beams blackened by years of coal dust, overflowed with more than 300 miners, their families, and workers from the neighboring counties. Banners hung across the ceiling with hand-painted messages like "Justice for our families" and "Dust Haven rises again." Jim Walker stood on the wooden stage in his weathered military cold-weather parka, collar high, zipper double-locked against the cold breeze seeping through the cracked windows. Rex sat at his heel, alert yet calm, scanning the room with intelligent eyes. For the first time, the old mining hall felt hopeful. In front of Jim, the newly restored pension documents lay neatly on a table. The federal court had ruled decisively, returning every cent Derek Cole stole and freezing his remaining assets for worker compensation. To oversee the transition, the court appointed Jim Walker as an independent supervisory advisor, an unexpected role for a man who had tried to live quietly. The miners gathered in rows of folding metal chairs, some still wearing their dusty work boots, others dressed in their best Sunday clothing. Among them was Elias Turner, the 62-year-old miner with weathered hands and silver beard who had testified with trembling courage. His face carried more peace now, though the deep lines carved by years underground remained. Elias Turner stepped forward, gripping a microphone with hands that once held pickaxes and drilling triggers. His denim jacket hung loosely over his thin frame, but his voice resonated with a strength built from decades of hard work. "Jim, you didn't just help us win a trial," Elias said, swallowing back emotion. "You saved our families. You saved Dust Haven." The room fell silent as every miner, from the youngest new hire to the oldest retiree, turned toward Jim with gratitude. Rex raised his head, sensing the weight of the moment. Jim simply rested a hand on the German shepherd's back and gave a quiet nod. Jim lifted the microphone, but didn't move from his place. His voice carried the calm firmness of someone who had weathered things far worse than lawsuits and courtrooms. "I didn't save this town," Jim said. "You did. Every one of you who stood up, who spoke the truth, who refused to let fear win. You fought for your own future." His eyes scanned the crowd, settling briefly on Dale Monroe, the thick-built coal cutter who held his wife's hand in the front row. Then on Nora Bennett, the auburn-haired environmental technician who now wore a confident blue blouse instead of her old gray uniform. The people who once trembled under Derek Cole's shadow now stood proudly in the open sunlight. Representatives from the new mining corporation, Beacon Ridge Industries, stood near the back of the hall. Their leader, Martin Caldwell, a 54-year-old executive with a salt-and-pepper beard and warm eyes, had arrived earlier that morning. Caldwell wore a simple gray wool coat and carried himself with a humility uncommon for corporate men. He approached Jim after the speech, extending a hand. "Mr. Walker, Beacon Ridge is committed to rebuilding trust," Caldwell said. "Safe conditions, transparent wages, and open books. We want to work with the people, not above them." Jim studied Caldwell's expression, the sincerity, the lack of ego, and nodded. Rex sniffed Caldwell's boots approvingly, a small but definitive vote of confidence. After Caldwell's brief introduction, the crowd erupted into applause. Families gathered around stations where volunteers handed out updated pension cards, legal documents, and information about new safety protocols. Nora Bennett stood at one table, explaining groundwater restoration plans to a group of mothers worried about their children. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight through the tall windows as she spoke with a newfound authority. "We're installing purification systems," Nora said. "We're cleaning Eastern Run, and we're testing every month. This town will drink clean water again." Nearby, Dale Monroe and a team of strong-armed miners lifted the new safety posters onto the walls, smiling proudly at their work. Outside, workers and volunteers raised Dust Haven's new banner over the entrance of the mine. The cloth was bright white, with bold black letters reading, "We protect those who work." Beneath the words was an illustration of a rugged miner standing beside a German shepherd, an image unmistakably inspired by Jim and Rex. Children gathered around the base of the frame, pointing at the painting with awe. Jim stood a short distance away, hands in his parka pockets, observing quietly. He never sought recognition, but the symbolic gesture touched him more deeply than he expected. Rex barked softly, as if telling him he deserved it. As the sun lowered, turning the sky into streaks of gold and purple, Jim walked along the gravel path leading towards the ridge overlooking Dust Haven. He wasn't alone. A teenage girl followed a few steps behind him, a new face in the story. Anna Reed, a 17-year-old with long blonde hair and a freckled nose, had approached Jim earlier that day. Her father died from the Eastern Run contamination 2 years prior. She had a quiet determination in her green eyes and a sketchbook under her arm. "Mr. Walker," she said softly as she reached him, "I want to help. I want to design safety posters and awareness campaigns. I'm good at art, and I want to make sure what happened to my dad never happens again." Jim encouraged her gently, admiring her courage. Night settled over the town as lanterns lit the mining yard. Workers gathered around a large bonfire celebrating the beginning of a new chapter. Music played from an old speaker, families danced, and laughter mixed with the crackling of flames. Jim stood beside Nora Bennett and Martin Caldwell, discussing practical next steps, training programs, environmental audits, and community oversight boards. Caldwell respected Jim's experience as a former military investigator, asking him to remain as a consultant for the next year. "Dust Haven deserves stability," Caldwell said. "With your guidance, I believe we can rebuild this the right way." Jim nodded thoughtfully, while Rex curled at his feet, tail gently thumping. As the fire burned lower, Jim looked toward the mountain ridge, toward the silhouette of the mines that had both scarred and shaped Dust Haven. Rex rose beside him, as if sensing the shift in his partner's thoughts. Jim inhaled the crisp night air, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. "We did good today, buddy," he murmured. Rex wagged his tail in approval. The moonlight reflected off the German shepherd's coat as the two stood together, overlooking a town finally free from fear. Dust Haven was healing. And though Jim knew the world was full of other battles, tonight wasn't for fighting. Tonight was for hope. As the first stars began to appear, Jim turned away from the ridge and gave Rex a gentle pat. "Come on, old friend," he whispered. "We've done our part. Let's head home." Rex barked once, sharp and eager, ready for the next path, whatever it would be. Together they walked down the hill toward the glowing lights of Dust Haven, leaving behind a mountain that had finally fallen and a community rising stronger than ever. No matter what darkness you're facing, keep your faith, hold your ground, and trust that God is already opening a way forward. If this story touched your heart, please share it, drop a comment, and subscribe for more. May God bless you and protect every step of your journey.